Landlords, are your properties safe and compliant? There are two pieces of legislation that are specifically relevant to the safety of your tenants within your private rented properties. The Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, Section 11, which is the Landlord's Repairing Obligations, and more recently, the Homes for Fitness and Habitation Act 2020. Section 11 of the Landlords and Tenant Act surrounding landlords' obligations for repairs basically tells landlords that they have an obligation to ensure the safety of the property and also have an obligation to maintain air, space, water and heating. Landlords, you must know that it is your job to carry out repairs on your properties as and when they are due. But do you know how quickly you need to do them? The timescales that you should work around? The legislation states that repairs should be carried out in a reasonable timescale. Reasonable is a word that is really hard to define because what's your reasonable may not be my reasonable. A reasonable timescale will depend on many things. The severity of the repair that has been reported. Is the tenant living in the property? All of these factors are taken into consideration when carrying out a repair within a reasonable timescale. Of course, if there was a major repair that had been reported to you, so for example, water was gushing through a ceiling, that would be classed as an urgent repair and therefore urgent attention would be needed. It may well be that you're not in a position to rectify or repair the item of maintenance that has been reported to you immediately. Parts may be required. But what you can do and what you should do as a landlord is take all reasonable steps to carry out any maintenance work or repairs within a reasonable timescale. The most common question and the most common repair that is reported is no hot water and heating. Of course, to the person living in the property, your tenant, this is an urgent repair. However, as a landlord, it is not always possible to rectify the problem as quickly as your tenants may like. An example in a scenario of no hot water and heating, if a tenant reports that they have no hot water and heating to you, you should aim to get an engineer out to the property within 24 hours. It may well be that upon arrival, the engineer is not able to remedy the problem, not able to give the tenants a solution. Parts may be required. In some circumstances, a new boiler is needed. These are not things that can be carried out within hours' notice, and therefore further time will be needed for you to remedy that problem. This doesn't mean, Mr. Landlord, that you have not worked in a reasonable timescale. You are working within what is reasonable and available to you at that moment in time. So unfortunately, under the legislation, there are no given time scales other than the word reasonable. And I encourage you to always act as quickly as you possibly can when carrying out repairs for your tenants, not just for the comfort of your tenants within your rented property, but to protect yourselves from any claims that the tenant may pursue. Tenants have the right, if they believe true, to report any outstanding maintenance issues to the local authority. The council, the Environmental Health Department, may then decide to attend the property and carry out a full HHS-RS inspection, which will not only look at the repair that the tenant has reported, it will look at the whole 29 hazards listed under the HHS-RS, which could potentially lead to a much larger list of jobs than the initial one that was reported. Section 11 of the Landlord and Tenant Act does also give responsibility to tenants though. Under the case Lord Denning versus Keane, Lord Denning stated that tenants should act in a tenant-like manner. They should change the light bulbs, change the washers on the tap, clear the gutters, keep the drains from unblocking. As you can see, the tenants are responsible and should do the small jobs throughout the home that are not necessarily deemed as maintenance. I hope that you're finding this informative. If you are, please do subscribe to the channel where you can find further updates on legislation within the private rented sector. And if you stick around until the end of the video, I have more information on how you as a landlord can stay safe and compliant. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of this section, there are two pieces of legislation that governs landlords needing to keep their properties safe. We've talked about the first, now let's look at the second, a more recent piece of legislation, Homes for Fitness and Habitation 2020. This piece of legislation is not in replacement of the one we've just discussed, but in addition to, and it focuses on areas that are not necessarily covered under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985. There are two key factors to this legislation. Firstly, and most concerningly, this piece of legislation gives tenants the ability to take a landlord to court for not maintaining his repairing obligations. For the first time ever, this legislation allows the tenant to go direct to the court without getting the council involved. This, of course, should be and could be of huge concern to landlords. The second being landlords are now responsible for hazards and repairs within communal areas. These are the two key factors of this legislation. As a landlord, you now have to make sure that at the start of tenancy and during the tenancy, that the property is fit for human habitation at all times. The only way you can do that, landlords, is by making sure you regularly inspect the property throughout the duration of the tenancy. Quite simply moving a tenant in at the beginning and documenting that the property is safe would not be sufficient under this piece of legislation. So firstly, Fit for Habitation is quite straightforward and simple. It is ensuring that you comply with all of the legislation and the safety aspects that you need to as a landlord. So for example, you will need a gas certificate, you will need an EICR, there will need to be working smoke alarms within the property, there will need to be no trip hazards, the property will need to be safe for a human to move into without harm. You need to ensure that you're regularly inspecting the properties to ensure that the condition of the property and the safety of the property is maintained throughout. Tenants don't always necessarily report repairs, so please do not rely on your tenant to be reporting repairs as your only defence. Now secondly, communal areas. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. If you're a landlord of a property in a purpose-built block of flats, there are communal areas that ultimately are the responsibility of the freeholder. However, as a landlord, when inspecting your property, when letting your property, you have an obligation now to ensure that the communal areas are again in line with the Homes for Fitness and Habitation Act, that they are safe and free from obstruction. As soon as you are aware that there is a problem within the communal area, I appreciate that in all circumstances you will not have the powers to remedy those problems. But what you do now have the responsibility to do is notify the freeholder immediately as you become aware. Now again, you cannot be responsible for tenant damage. You cannot be responsible or held responsible for malicious damage from the tenant. However, the number one key factor for you as a landlord is to ensure the safety and security of your tenants at the beginning of the tenancy and throughout the tenancy. Failure to comply with either of these pieces of legislation, as I've said, can lead to prosecution from the tenant direct to the court without the need to inform the council. Penalties issued from the council, fines, improvement notices. If an improvement notice is served from the council, this can restrict your rights to gaining possession of your property. Landlords, keep your properties safe and compliant and maintain your repairing obligations throughout. Now landlords, there are over 170 pieces of legislation which is growing annually. This is why I run a quarterly webinar where we spend 2 hours drilling into the various different pieces of legislation in more detail. To register on the next webinar, click on the link in the description below to reserve your seat. If you would like to learn more now, please click here to watch more videos about compliance and legislation.